Welcome back to a new video. Our main objective for today's video is to learn about getters, setters, and Lateinit Modifier. Maybe if we have some time, we'll talk about more stuff, but let's just focus on the things we got on the list. Let's first start with getters and setters. As you can see here, I have declared an abstract class creator, and it has one abstract property, full name of type string, and notice we created with the var keyword. You can see that we have declared the class within the same file as the main function. So we are allowed to do this just like the functions we declare within the same file. As far as we know, creating an instance of creature class directly is not allowed. For that, we need another class that inherits from the creature class. And here I'm going to make a class called person, and this person here is going to have a couple of properties. Val first name, type string, and val last name of type string as well. Now let's make our person class inherit from creature, so creature, and open the empty constructor of creature. Lastly, open the body of the person class. And notice here we have an error because we have to implement the abstract property. So we could just over here and implement constructor parameter as a constructor parameter like you see here. So it will be just a constructor parameter, and whenever we create an object of this Mikey guy or this person class, so I'm gonna call it Mikey, and I'm gonna do person, and the first name is going to be Mikey, then the last name is going to be Anderson, for instance, then the full name is going to be Mikey Anderson. So here we pass the full name from outside of the class when we create an instance. But we don't want that because we need to understand what are the getters and the setters. So if you don't want to implement it within the constructor, you could implement it within the body. And once you do that, you'd have the getters and the setters. You would see that the compiler added the getters and the setters for you when you implement an abstract property as a member within the class body. Let's just delete Mikey Anderson here and continue with our getters and setters. So these both called get and set are considered to be functions or methods in other languages. In Kotlin, they are similar to functions, but they are called initializers. Let's first start with the get. So the get is used to return the initial value or the default value for a property. And always make sure that whatever you return from the get must be the same type as the type that was specified for the property. So say for example here, I'm going to return 123, which is a string because it has double quotation marks here. And now we have this Mikey instance. So say for example, I wish to print the full name. So we're going to say Mikey dot full name. Now, whenever you call Mikey dot full name, the get method is called automatically. So to verify our output, I'm just going to print this to the console, println, and now let's run the program. And here comes the result, 1, 2, and 3. Great. Another thing to note about get that it can have a body. So this syntax is called the shorthand syntax for the get. You could have a body, and the purpose of having a body for the get is whenever you have some kind of initialization, for instance, like maybe your value depends on some other value, for example sum equal to 1 plus 1, and you want to add this sum to your return value. So here, just like a function that returns something, you're going to say return 1 2 or for example 1, and here I'm just going to add the sum, then I'm going to add 3. And now let's run the program. And here we have 1 2 3 because the sum was added between 3 and 1, which is equal to 2, and that's why we should use the body if we have initial setup to do for our returned value. Great. Now let's head to the set initializer. So the set initializer, as you can see, it is just like a function. It's called set, and it takes something as a parameter, and then it has its body. Now, so to add your information, the set function doesn't return anything. It just sets a value to our property here. And here we can access our value or the property with something called field. So the field here refers to our field here. So this field is equivalent to the property name. And any value that you receive from the set initializer, you add it to the field or you reassign the field to the value. So I know this might be confusing. Let's just see what I mean here. So whenever you want to reassign the full name of Mikey, so full name of Mikey is equal to something. So whenever you do this here, the set function is called, and the value here is the value that the function returns or the initializer receives. And whenever it receives this value, it reassigns the field to that value. And now we cannot do this because we have to first initialize our property here to a default value as it was marked with the var or made with the var keyword. So I'm just going to make add initializer and it will add a default empty string. Now let's say for example you want to print the value. So Mikey dot full name. And now we know whenever we do this, the get function is going to be called. But what do you expect would happen? Would we receive this here or the get here? Let's just run the program and see the result. We get 1, 2, 3, as the get function or the get initializer overrides the value that the set initializer sets for our value. So let's say we will delete the get initializer and we will just leave the set initializer. Without modifying anything, I'm just going to run the program. And here we get something because we don't have the get initializer no more. Now let's just get back our get initializer back to the code, and we are going to change the declaration of our property here to be started with a val instead of var. Val here as well. And notice here we have an error because having the set initializer is not allowed. You cannot reset a variable that was started with the val keyword. So this is not allowed. You're going to delete it. And also notice here the val variables are not allowed to have an initial value. So we're just going to delete the initial value, and all we are going to depend on is going to be our get initializer here. So what I want to do is to return the first name along with the last name, and when we run the program you would see that we have them both as a full name. So back to our main activity, we cannot reassign our property here just like before because for two reasons. We don't have the set initializer, and because it's a read-only property or a property that was made with the val keyword, so we cannot reassign it. So just going to delete this line here, and now I'm going to run the program to see the output. Here Mikey Anderson, just like we did in the get initializer. For the sake of practice, let's have another example for the initializers. So here we have a class called student takes marks in the constructor, which is just a list of integers. And here within the student's body, we have a val average, which is a double. And here we're going to calculate the marks of the student. So whenever you create a variable, whatever it was, a val or var, within any class, you have two options. First, you have to add an initial value, or you have to use the get initializer. And here we don't need to add the initial value, as we need some calculations to get the average of the marks. So for that we are going to use the get initializer with its body. That's cool. Now we're going to make a variable, and this variable is going to be immutable, so the var sum of marks, and here we're going to save the sum of the marks. Later here we're going to have a loop, so loop to add every number to the sum here. So I'm going to say marks dot for each. Now I cannot access the marks because the marks is not annotated with var or val, so it will not be accessible within any method or within any function. So get considered to be a function because it has a body, So we cannot access the marks within any closures like these closures here, the curly braces. Though we could access it from here. For example, marks is equal to marks in the constructor. I'm just going to name this underscore marks. We can access the marks from here, but to make it accessible within any closures, we have to add the val or var keyword. So I'm going to make the val keyword here and delete our marks property. Now the marks is now accessible. Now we're going to use the function within Kotlin standard library, which is called for each. So for each here, provide us with a loop instead of writing us ourselves, and it returns the number here as an argument. So I'm just going to call it mark, and for each mark I'm going to add it to our mark here. Once we're done, we are going to return the sum of marks divided by the marks.size to calculate the average. This is all not considered to be a double, so we have to convert the marks to double. Now let's try the class or the average. So I'm going to make val student equal to student, and here I'm going to provide the marks. So list of, maybe he was too nerdy, so 80, maybe 70, maybe 95, and 40. Now let's just print the average. So the average is students.average. Let's run the program. And here we got the average. Let's have our last example with the initializers. But before that, let's just focus on two notes here about initializers. So initializers are just not a new thing. They are added automatically for any variable that you make. This is the default implementation for them. So the get will get just the field or the value of the field, and set will set just the value to the field. So having them here with this implementation is redundant, as their implementation under the hood is the same. That's great. So now I have created an instance of the day class, and I have set the value. So here day.currentDay just called sits but in the background, and also this one here, and day.currentDay here called get but in the background as well. Cool. Let's just get them back to discuss one last thing. So whenever you have get and set, whenever you want to add them to any property that you have, make sure always to make them followed by or make them after your property. So say for instance, I'm going to add another property here. I'm going to be val maybe day of the week, and it's just going to be string and going to equal to some value. So the set here, make it var. So the set here is not considered to be to the current day. It's considered to be to the day of the week property here. So always make sure to place getters and setters underneath the property that you wish to have the getters and setters for, as they are always going to be attached to the nearest variable or the nearest property from the top. Okay, that's cool. Now let's discuss the last example. Now we know we don't need to add the getters and setters unless we have a custom behavior that we want to add to them, or that we wish to execute before adding the value for the properties. So here, whenever you just add daynum, day.daynum equal to 0, you here call the set method under the hood, and day.daynum, here you call the get function or the get initializer under the hood. Great. So here you can see we have an access to them. We can change the value of the day whenever we want. So just a day represent the number of the days and numbers of the days of the week. And maybe you don't want this behavior. Maybe you want only to make your class able to change the value of the property here. So the first thing will come to your mind is to make it private. Well, that's a good idea. We're gonna make it private, but we will not be able to access it from the outside. Maybe you'd say I'm gonna make another property, for instance, called val underscore daynum, and it's going to equal to our daynum here. And whenever we want to do that, we're just going to print in day.daynum. Yes, it will work, but we can have a convenient way to do that. So say, for instance, you are just going to make it public, and nobody from outside can reassign the value. So for that, you're going to add private set underneath the variable. And now whenever you add daynum equal to some value, you will not be able to do that. Cannot assign daynum to a set is a private inday. As you see, it's a private set. You cannot access it. Whenever you delete it, you'll be able to access it. But now at least we have a public get, and public get which makes us able to access the value. So daynum day.daynum, and here we can access the value. And whenever you want to assign or reassign the value, just gonna make a helper function. So for fun increment day is gonna be a function, and here I'm just gonna say daynum plus plus to increment the day by 1. So here I'm just gonna call the function day.increment day, and I'm gonna print it before and after to see the difference. And here we got 0 before incrementing and 1 after incrementing. Finally, we have reached to talk about the Lateinit modifier. So the Lateinit modifier is just a modifier that you could add to any variables, and always make sure that these variables are read and write variables, like the variable here. So just made with the var keyword, so it's immutable, we can change it. So this Lateinit modifier is only allowed to be added to a var variable. Great. So what's the Lateinit? Lateinit is just a keyword that tells the compiler that you are going to initialize this variable later within the code. So whenever you don't have the Lateinit, you're gonna have an error saying that you have to a lot of stuff. You have to add the Lateinit modifier if you want to. You have to add an initializer as a first or as a default value. You have to make it abstract if you want to, move it to the constructor to have it from the outside, or add the getters and setters. Maybe you don't want any of these. So for that, you are going to have the Lateinit modifier just to get rid of that error, and then you're going to initialize it later within the code. So name is equal to some citizen, for example. Great. Lateinit modifier also come very handy when you want to avoid null checks. So say for instance, I'm just going to comment this out. Say for instance, our Lateinit var name is going to be equal to some class. For example, just char category, for example. So I don't have a default value for this char category class, and for that it will just give me the same error over and over again without the Lateinit modifier. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to add the initial value after make it nullable. So I'm going to add the initial value here, and now I'm going to be okay without the error. And whenever I want to access the name, for example name.name, you know, I'm going to have the add to non-null assertion operator, the question mark operator, and maybe we have to add the if else to check if it wasn't null. So Lateinit just saves you a lot to not have this null checks over the place. Great. Now let's get it back to string, and within the init block, we are going to assign it to some citizen. I think I have it here, so I'm just going to delete this, and here I'm just going to run the program. So whenever we access the name, we are going to get the some citizen. Let's say, for instance, you forgot to initialize your name. So I'm just gonna comment this out, and now we are trying to access the name, which is a Lateinit property, and we didn't initialize it to any variable or any value. You can see that we don't have any compile time errors, everything works, but whenever we run the program, we would have the following error or following exception: uninitialized property access exception. So here it says that you tried to access a Lateinit property that wasn't initialized to some value. So always make sure to initialize it, or unless you're going to have this fatal exception and your application is going to be terminated. So that was it for today's video. I hope you liked what you have learned today, and I hope to see you in the next one.